Hey there again, AP Environmental Science. Here we go with sustainability, economics, and equity. This is a two-part series here. We're going to break this down into sustainability and economics together, and then talk about the regulations that affect equity. Although citizens of Mexico call the border with the United States La Línea, or the line, that's what they call the border. It stretches 3,200 kilometers, that's 2,000 miles. It's more of a network of passages and passageways than it is a real division. Trade among people and cultures across this international boundary clearly affects both countries. The link between Mexico and America economies, that's actually strengthened by globalization and increase in trade. And so there's not a better example of how this is than through what we would call an industrial industry or an assembly plant. So in the 1960s, industry allows international companies to import materials and equipment free of any tariffs or taxes. And this is true of the industry in Mexico. And this was all established in, I think, the early 1960s, where equipment that would help industry across the U.S. and Mexican border would be free of any taxes. And then they would allow the exported, like finished goods, to be moved to other countries, like Canada, for instance. So in 1994, the United States, Canada, and Mexico passed what we call the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which was intended to increase trade among the three countries by reducing tariffs and other taxes, as well as any sort of regulations. And this was intended to benefit all three countries. So the use of what's called Maquiladoras, or those are factories that are inside of Mexico that are oftentimes owned and run by Americans, and Americans are using those factories obviously to make goods cheaper, and then we're sending the finished product out tax-free. So after NAFTA passed, these laws were created, the export of the assembled products began to triple. So from 1995 to 2000, the maquiladoras were extremely successful in this whole process. And these factories, which export 90% of their products to the United States, currently constitute about 80% of the economy in the northern border region of Mexico. And that's about a quarter of Mexico's entire GDP. So that's a lot for these factories. And while the jobs have been welcomed by this economically depressed area since the 60s, there have been many negative consequences, including industrial pollution, poor working conditions, and of course, not to mention crime in the area that have increased since the maquiladoras have moved in. So, as recently as the last couple years, discrimination has also kind of come into play. In addition to these factories raising questions about like social justice, because much of the profit is essentially sent to other countries and not Mexico. And not to oftentimes play on this environmental thing, but in terms of environment, the maquiladoras operate often on this contaminated type of industrial waste setting, and that borders this region. So environmental regulations are pretty lackadaisical, to say the least, in Mexico, and the companies are benefiting from that. They don't have to ship out waste or dispose of it properly, and that saves them a lot of money, because disposing of all these toxic chemicals and heavy metals, not only is it costly, but once it goes into the groundwater and into the surface water, the pollution can be significant. And now, since we're talking since the 60s, we're up on decades and decades of this pollution basically going unregulated. Many of these factories also, they employ a lot of women, and those women are of reproductive age. And although the population is vulnerable, just in a sense, just due to poverty in that area, We're talking about unenvironmentally regulated factories on a border here where essentially there's a lot of reproductive women who are really vulnerable and the fetuses are really vulnerable to these toxic chemicals. All right, so in addition to pollution, let's just talk about the manufacturing process in general. An increase in human population in these maquiladora areas has basically added to other environmental problems. So many cities which these factories are situated in, they've got a lot of sewage treatment problems, they've got trash collection issues, and the solid waste pollution areas and sources in this particular border area, you know, instead of having it disposed of properly, it just starts to accumulate. And so, outside of just environmental problems and just health problems, let's talk about social abuses that also occur. Employers often test women for pregnancy before they're even hired, and those who become pregnant may actually just be fired. There are no laws in Mexico that protect women like we have FMLA here in the United States. So, managers employ a lot of underage workers. And factory conditions are often hazardous, and employees are often unaware of even the risk, and they even lack the right to know what kind of conditions that they're working in. And essentially, even if they do post warning signs, they don't have to post them in Spanish because they're not technically Spanish or Mexican companies. So we have a lot of companies that are exploiting the poverty that's in this region, and sometimes they don't even have to pay them properly. Wages there are barely enough to support the employees' needs, and on average, these factory workers earn the equivalent of just a few dollars per day. And these wages have remained pretty much the same throughout the last few decades, and even though, as we all know, the cost of living has risen, especially there on the Mexican border. Sometimes the profits from these factories, they don't even enter Mexico at all, or the Mexican economy, but they rather go home to other countries where the companies are actually based out of. Many observers believe that northern Mexico pays the social and environmental price for these factories, while foreign companies basically reap the benefit. So, free trade and globalization agreements like NAFTA, they're designed to enhance development and grow economies by facilitating these international business conditions. However, in northern Mexico, increased free trade has essentially stimulated an industry that in many cases sacrifices the well-being of people and environmental health. But nevertheless, because many people are employed by this industry, money does not enter the local economy, but it can just help the individual itself. Environmental scientists are interested in how human and social welfare are connected, and how the well-being of the actual person and the environment and the situation that they're in are also affected and connected. If we could give equal attention to not only the economic profit in this area, but also the environmental integrity and the overall human welfare, we can ultimately create a more sustainable development. As you look at these pictures here, you can see the actual border between that is Mexico and that is the United States. And so just if we run parallel to traffic, this right here is the Mexican border. And if we look up more closely right here, this is people entering, and this is people entering, into Mexico from the United States. You can also see that there's just this huge difference in traffic between the U.S. border and also the Mexico border. And it just becomes quite apparent when you look at these pictures that as far as sustainability and equity here, there's a significant amount of pollution that's going on one side versus the other.